So good to see everybody. Tonight is the beginning of a brand new session, a new series that I struggled to get a good name. So this is probably not a good name, but basically what we're going to do is look at what happened to the United States in the 50 years after the Civil War, basically. In our classes in college, and when I took it, it was this way, and I'm sure when you took it, it was this way. The first American history class, if you took both, ends with Reconstruction. And then the next one picks up. And now that we're still, roughly, depending on when you want to count, 250 years or so, it's still basically halfway. It's certainly halfway when we think about, or a little less than halfway, we think about when the Constitution was formed. But there just seems to be this sense of that was a before, and then the Civil War happens, and then there's definitely an after. And so we saw that last time. And so that's what we're doing tonight. We're going to be looking at where the series is on what I'm calling the social and cultural development of the country in this period, really leading into World War I. I mean, obviously you can see I've got the year 1920s and an S there, so World War I is before that. But our participation in World War I was kind of slight. My grandfather fought in it, and so it's not that it's not unimportant. In fact, I think World War I is perhaps the most important event of the 20th century. I know, shocking for some people, that I think of it more important than World War II. And we may, in the future, somewhere next year, we may talk about World War I. But societally and culturally, the country shifts. And one of the things that I've tried to say to you guys is when you study history, you can see as this large pattern, so this large kind of context of a journey, and it happens in phases. And so when you kind of can see that there was the end of one phase, so the Civil War, Reconstruction, the beginning of another phase, it's helpful to try to say, well, what happened and how did the country change? How did it transform? So that's kind of what we're going to look at here as we kind of work our way through. So you may remember that, and I've done this series with you, that I am someone who believes in a historic pattern of roughly 80-ish years. After the Great Crisis period, you come back around to the beginning, and the beginning is known as the high. If you think of it as seasons, it's be like going to spring out of winter. Well, after this Great Crisis moment, for the only time in the large pattern, the high was not very high. All across the country, the institutions and the regions and all of life changed. And when I teach the American History Modern class, we'll spend the first month looking at this material of kind of, how did it transform in the South, in the West, in the North? What goes on that kind of produces this cultural and social change that kind of sets in motion everything that dominates the 20th century? So that's really what we're going to be talking about in this series. And tonight, we'll be focusing on probably the most impactful change, and that is the emergence of industry. So we'll get to that in just a second. I just kind of want to set us up both for the whole series and also for tonight, but kind of the whole series. Here's this chart. I've showed you this chart before. I know it's a lot of information, but if you just look on this left-hand column, you'll see the 5 cycles that we've gone through. And so I've told you before, it's roughly a 500-year cycle. You can actually go back to the 1300s, and the focus is Anglo-American, so England and America. So that's kind of the focus. You can see a similar pattern in other parts of the world, but obviously for me, our focus is our country and kind of our story. And you can see, again, 80-ish, right? But the next thing I want you to note is the next column right beside the list is where you see high, right? So what happens is a country or the people go through a crisis in which everything that foundationally seems to be shaken and changed. And it is, because it's a crisis. and that's the winter season, or what authors Strauss and Howe call the fourth turning, or what I just have called the Great Crisis cycle, so the 20 years or so of that time period. And when you come out of it, you should be happy. So yay, there's a happy. So here's another way of looking at it, right? So at the conclusion of each one of the turnings, you're kind of moving through the seasons. And if you look down here at the bottom, you can see the fourth turning, or the crisis title, winter, right? But then winter goes back to spring. So you can just read this, right? An upbeat era of strengthening institutions, hope for the future, yay! And it's not hard to understand that. Those who survive, and let me say, for everyone who goes through the crisis, most of us survive, most of us live through it. Then there's this feeling of joy. It's like, yes, we made it through. Yay, let's celebrate. And again, it's not too much, unlike when there's a real winter, which we don't have here. You come out of it into spring, and there's all the love. You're just so excited. You have warm weather again. You can maybe put on shorts or short sleeves. You may walk out in the grass with no shoes on. You see the butterflies begin to come. Flowers begin to come out of the ground. It's very exciting, right? Well, coming out of the Civil War age, that doesn't happen much. It's one of the shortest highs in the pattern. And you go immediately into the next, which is the second phase, which is the spiritual awakening. And you can see on the chart here, when it says spiritual awakening, it's questioning the values of the past. So even though there's a high, so you think of it moving in a positive and upward direction, everybody's happy, sort of spiritually, you begin to raise questions. It's not negative, nobody's mad, but you're kind of challenging the past. Now, in the cycle, this is the moment that you're beginning to set up what will be the next great crisis at the 80-ish year mark. And again, 80 is really loose, right? 80, 90 year kind of period. And so that's kind of how the pattern has gone over all these years. Well, so coming out of the Civil War period, it's a very short high, and that's largely because of Reconstruction. Reconstruction does not go well. And so what we will see over this series we're looking at is some changes. And again, some of these are the things that end up being, I guess we could say negative, but they're detrimental to the high. They're not allowing the kind of flourishing of kind of feeling settled, and we're moving in a new direction, and it's all positive, right? And we didn't really talk at length about Reconstruction last time. I mentioned a few things to you, and we're not going to belabor Reconstruction. We will look more at the South, particularly when we do our series, our session in this series on civil rights. But it'll come up here and there. But largely, we just can say that Reconstruction was a missed opportunity. And rather than emerging from Reconstruction in a cohesive, we're all on the same page, we survived the crisis of Civil War, now let's go forward, you end up divided. And I think I told you, Reconstruction, typically you think of Reconstruction as having three goals: political reunion and vitalization of the South, economic diversification of the South, and civil rights. And when you measure that, the Reconstruction failed on all three of those efforts, at least at that time. And so in its place, you see capitalism explode. There's nothing wrong with capitalism, but as we're going to see, it kind of thwarts civic engagement. As I tell the students, when we've studied American History 1, from the beginning, Jamestown, all the way to the Civil War, you typically get the story of our leading citizens, male and female, being engaged in civic work, right? And politically and elected and kind of engaged in the cooperative community moving forward as a society. When you start studying American History 2, you don't hear that at all. In fact, you sort of feel like all the best people go into business. Now, there's, again, nothing wrong with going into business, but you begin wondering, like, well, what happened there? We will see next week the movement of a huge proportion of society from the agrarian society on the farm to the cities. Now, you and I live in a city. We live in a metro region and we choose to. I mean, I could live anywhere, you could live anywhere. We've chosen to live here. So we understand the allure of the city, but that was transformative, arguably in a negative way. And then perhaps worse, just corruption. Again, there is some corruption, particularly political corruption, when you study pre-Civil War, but not like what we get here. And it starts with Reconstruction. It's at all levels, from the White House. As much as I love Grant and think that he's a much better president than people give him credit for, his administration was not corruption-free. And so you begin to start seeing this allure for power and money, and it all kind of ruins the whole process. Again, it wasn't all bad in Reconstruction. And we did see, I showed you this slide 2 weeks ago, that for the freed slaves, there was some general improvement. There was some voting, there were some elected officials, and there was some economic opportunity, but not much. And so thus, when we get to that spiritual awakening, and as we look through this series we're going to do on society and culture change, you're going to see a pressing and a fighting for, we could loosely say, rights, but improvement, right? For renewal, for making it better. Now, there's, again, nothing wrong with that. I think in one sense, that's what all life is like. All of life, all the time, is a sense of the individual citizen thinking what could make it better. And so there's nothing wrong with that. But when you look at that emerging so quickly after the crisis, again, it's this note that something didn't go right, because normally that would not have happened till really the unraveling, which would have been 40 or something years later. Instead, pretty early on, people are frustrated and they're experiencing the change to the country that they can't really articulate. Now, what has happened? That's the question. Why did this happen, right? Well, what really begins to happen in Reconstruction is that the Republican Party, defending the change for the freed slaves, is forced into making a series of amendments to the Constitution that ultimately transform the Constitution. As you may remember from your study as a young person, the Bill of Rights starts with, Congress shall make no law. And it basically begins a process of explaining the limits to the federal government. And you may remember when we talked about the Constitution a couple of years ago, it was Madison being attacked by kind of other rock stars like Patrick Henry and Sam Adams saying, you've not protected our rights. And so the Bill of Rights, what we call the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments, were constructed, and not all 10, but basically the first 7 for sure, are talking about what Congress is not allowed to do, the federal government is not allowed to do. But the 13th Amendment, which we talked about in our study on the Civil War, was trying to clearly state that there could be no more slavery. And that one makes a lot of sense, right? And what happened was the South, and the Democratic Party in particular, was so opposed to any positive change for African Americans that it forced the Republican Party to ultimately have to work in a way to defend what should have been understood. Meaning, had Madison been alive in 1865, and someone had said, okay, now that we've ended slavery, what does that mean? He would have said, well, these people will have all the rights of everybody else. There'd be no limit to their rights. Madison believed that the Constitution gave an implied sense of rights. I mean, Madison was against needing the Bill of Rights. He didn't think they were necessary. For Madison, the fact that the Constitution never said Congress could make a law to restrict free speech meant that they could not ever restrict free speech. Ergo, for Madison, we don't need an amendment. Well, Sam Adams, Patrick Henry, the others, they disagreed, right? So that gets into the whole question of loose and strict construction. But when we get to Reconstruction, we find that in one sense, Patrick Henry was right, because here, particularly in the South, but also in the North, and largely only in the Democratic Party, you see a deep opposition to any extension of rights to freedmen. So this takes us back to the question of Locke and Hobbes. where's the power going to lie? Does it lie with Congress? Does it lie with a limited government, which is what Locke would say, or does it lie with a stronger government necessary to protect people, which is what Hobbes would say? Well, the fight through the Civil War has moved the game lever, because it's not really an either or between Locke and Hobbes. It's kind of moving on a continuum. It moves the game lever more towards Hobbes. And so you see that with the 14th Amendment, which, so here's these two quotes from Hobbes and Locke I like a lot. You know these, and we're not going to spend a lot of time here. Hobbes is saying that the human is naturally self-focused, and so then we'll act in a way towards one another that is like a condition called war, and thus we need a strong central government. Locke's position is, no, the human is largely good, and in the state of nature, reason will basically teach mankind, and no one will harm another in life, health, liberty, or possession. Usually that gets shortened down to, Locke says, in the natural state, the human has the rights from God of life, liberty, and property. So this is a constant back and forth, and as I've told you before, this is, I would say, what our battle is right now. And it's not unique that it's happening in the year 2020. It's a continuation of a very long debate we've been having. So the 14th Amendment was forced on Congress to some degree because of the unwillingness of the South and the Democratic Party to support those implied rights. In the 14th Amendment, now for the very first time, the principle of citizenship is defined, and the idea of civil rights is expressed. It had never been there before, it had been implied. Now it's expressed. And it shifts the focus and the power from the amendments restricting Congress or the government to now a moment where Congress has its power extended. And to some degree, the design is to protect citizens, and from whom? From the states. So it's a complete opposite of where our founders were initially. Now, again, this should have been the end of it, but it wasn't, because even after there's this effort to make sure that the 14th Amendment allows citizenship, there were multiple states in the South, again, largely completely controlled by the Democratic Party, who did everything in their power to eliminate the ability of the freedmen to be able to vote. So the 15th Amendment comes along and expressly states that you cannot deny these people the right to vote simply by their race. So these 13, 14, 15 amendments are kind of why you can see the change of how these things kind of worked out. And so now, as we move into the 1880s and 1890s, as someone feels like things are not well for them, they will be appealing to the government to fix it. And in this time period of, say, 1880s to 1910, the government won't honestly know how to do that. So part of the transition we're looking at societally is, how does culture and society shift at a time when the expectations begin to grow for the government to do something for us or to protect us. At the same time, the government's not sure exactly how to do that. So the thing we're going to look at tonight, the rest of our time, is on the development of industry. Now, I'm certain that you remember from school studying about the Industrial Revolution. And when I was in school, and I bet when you were in school, you often were taught about what was called the first Industrial Revolution and then the second Industrial Revolution. Now, most historians will use the term early and later as if there's just one Industrial Revolution, but it does have an early period and it does have a later period. So the early period's not our focus tonight. It really would have been something you would have, we sort of did talk about it earlier in a couple of different other series of the past couple of years. But ultimately, the early is really centered on England. It's centered on water and coal, and water to create steam, and steam to create the steam engine. And with particularly the steam engine, the big development was the textile industry. And what will be the dominant industry that will bridge the two will be the railroad. The railroad will grow from, say, 1835 to, into the 20th century, and it will be the dominant industry. The later Industrial Revolution picks up at the time that we're looking at in England in the 1850s. In America, it's more in the 1860s, 1870s, not only due to the Civil War, but the Civil War helps push industry, just like World War II will help push industry down to the demand for, protecting and developing for the military. The later Industrial Revolution will start in England, but it will not be only in England. So when you talk about the early Industrial Revolution, certainly there's some industry in France and Germany and the United States, but it's really England. England is this country that is moving at light speed ahead of all the other countries in the early Industrial Revolution. But in the latter Industrial Revolution, you'll see England in a competition, predominantly with Germany and then with the United States. And when you do study World War I history and you look at what was causing the way in the Industrial Revolution and the challenge or the growth of competitors with England will be a key piece of the puzzle. Now there's other players, Russia, Italy, France, Japan to some degree, but really it's England, but then she's being chased by Germany and the United States. The focus in the latter Industrial Revolution turns to electricity and steel, and of course, what becomes the most dominant to this very day at least is oil, and oil leading ultimately to the combustion engine and gasoline. Here, the dominant industries I'm about to show you will start with the railroad, but the car and radio will become the two dominant powers that kind of really move forward the idea of the latter Industrial Revolution. So we want to focus in on how did the Industrial Revolution impact and change the United States? Because again, if you study just the growth of the industrial movement, you don't really see a tremendous amount of change to the United States in the time period of the early phase. It's there. We mentioned it when we talked about the American system. We talked about the market revolution happening in the 1820s. It feeds manifest destiny just a little bit, but it's not really. But here, our country will transform through the Industrial Revolution, but it's the later Industrial Revolution. And the railroad really sets the stage. The railroad becomes the first industry. Now, when I say first industry, we're talking about a national industry. So one of the big changes that occurs for industry is that it slips the bonds of just regional. I just finished, I think I told you a couple of weeks ago, I finished a wonderful book called Pioneers. It talks about the development in Ohio in its earliest days. And the author, writing about a couple of towns in the Ohio River, talked about the industry of shipbuilding on the Ohio River, right? So there was industry, but it's not like we know it. In fact, if we were there in person, what I would do, and I ask my students this all the time, tell me about national industries. And they can mention Apple. They talk about Google. They talk about Amazon. They talk about, Ford or Microsoft, the big tech companies, the big media companies. Disney, right? Disney's all over the world, right? So the pandemic, what's happening in Tokyo Disney, what's happening in Paris Disney. It's no longer just a regional thing in a regional location. And so the railroad is the first to kind of lead us there. We talked about on our way into the Civil War, the development of the beginnings of the Transcontinental Railroad. From 62 to 69, we build the Transcontinental Railroad. It's an amazing achievement. It's worth studying and reading about. It begins to show us, though, some of the challenges that are going to come with us with industry. For instance, the federal government has to be deeply involved in this. And this begins to intertwine business and government at a scale that really worries people. By the late 1800s, the West and the East are linked through these great railroads. So vast swaths of land are controlled by a few companies. Now, ultimately, I showed you this map last time. These decisions that they make to create these railroads will become our interstates. So you can see already the laying the foundation through industry for the modern nation in the development of what we the interstates. Now, and here's a map you can see of England, and just showing those red lines are showing you the railroads. You can see how deeply developed England is, obviously, compared to everywhere else. So clearly they were far and ahead away. One of the things that will happen to England is that she does not have any oil. Of course, you and I know today she has oil in the North Sea, but they don't know that back then. So this is going to be some interesting aspects of what happens to her industry as you move to that second. You move away from coal into oil, England's going to struggle some. Well, what does railroad do for us? Well, it kind of gives us the structure of business. Again, if we were in person, I would have you tell me, what is a big business? And you're going to say things like bureaucracy. You're going to say things like white collar. You're going to say things like middle management. You're going to talk about how businesses cooperate and compete, mergers, buyouts. It's the introduction of stockholders. So people are owners, quote unquote, in a company that they don't have any relationship to. They're not like related to the person in charge. It's not like they live nearby. The banks will start to take a bigger and bigger role. This all happens with the railroad. You begin to see railroad industries trying to compete with each other through price wars. They'll give a price break to one person, but not somebody else. And that will impact those industries. You begin to see, as we said a minute ago, the intertwining of politics and industry, where you start having lobbyists. Now, there had been some lobbyists going into the time of the Civil War, but now you're going to have a tremendous amount of money being put on, lawyers or people who know somebody to go to the halls of government, both state and national, to try and convince them to vote a certain way or do a certain thing, all at the behest of these few powerful industries. So again, you and I know business today, but this was brand new for the country. This had not existed. And you can see the changes that begin to occur as you get the idea of a corporation, right? There were changes that were made. And again, this starts in England. One of the reasons why England's so successful early was because they had the most well-developed and well-funded banking. So because of that, obviously we all know, you need money to make money, and money makes the world go around, all that kind of stuff. Well, this is going to be really important in the development of a variety of industries. And the more that the banking can get involved, the more opportunity there will be, particularly when you get to stocks and stockbrokers and the market, right? So financiers. We're not really at the place where you have like today where somebody has an idea and they go and look for somebody to make an initial investment. We're not at that point yet, but you are at places where you're going to have certain people able to invest money in an idea that will allow them to possibly make more money. You're going to see changes through corporation with the idea of mass production of goods. This had never happened before. You might live near somebody who made a really good wagon, and that wagon maker or that dressmaker might make several of those over a given year for those nearby, but they would never be mass produced. Now, early mass production does start with the textile industries in clothing, and you see this in the 1820s and 1830s in New England, but nothing like what we're about to see. And so you get this kind of nationwide connected thing. And again, we're very comfortable with this. We know if we hop on a plane and we go to some other spot in the world, we're going to find a McDonald's, we'll see a Walmart or a Target, we'll see a CVS. We're comfortable with the idea of there being an industry that spreads across the country. But it did deeply change our experience of what the nation was. And so some of the ways that it changed, you can see here, right? So you begin to see a shift in what's the purpose of the creation, right? So that person who made a dress, or that person who was a blacksmith, who made some kind of, hinges for your doors, right? They would be trying to make excellence. And now it's not about necessarily making excellence, it's about making several so you can have economic success. It became more important for the board of directors for them to make money, for them to make money for the stockholders. And there kind of begins to be this interpersonal break between the owner and the consumer. They don't know each other like they would have in the previous, iteration pre-Civil War. You start seeing the elimination of the family business, or you start seeing the elimination of the craftsperson, right? And you start seeing this emergence of, people needing to have a certain technology knowledge to be able to work at a certain place. You see the emergence of white collar work at a certain place. And so you get this idea of white collar versus blue collar. White collar is going to make a little more money. They're not working as physically strenuous. Another thing that's going to have a deep, deep impact on the country is the emergence of sales, that things are being made to be sold. Previously, most people made what they needed themselves in the 19th century, but occasionally you would buy something. And so that book I was telling you about Ohio, they would talk about in the earliest iterations of the little town, different first, right? So the first boat maker, the first doctor, and one was the first general store. And so that general store would have goods for the colonists, that's what they were, making their way in Ohio in, say, 1790, 1805. But you didn't go to buy things. You and I know we're heading close to Thanksgiving, and apparently it's going to be unlike any Thanksgiving we've ever experienced in this country with the pandemic and some other things that are going on. I bet you there's still going to be people trying to push and push and push for Black Friday and come spend some money and buy things. And I might be willing to suggest that most of what we buy would not be because somebody needed it, but just because we felt like giving them something, which again, it's great, but it's a different story, right? It's a different story in the journey. And so this idea of sales was a key aspect. The corporations crisscross the country. By the time you get to 1920, there's major industry all over the country. Certain regions would have certain things. So the Northwest was the timber industry, Nevada, the California mountains, part of Utah and Colorado, mining industry, in the Great Plains, agribusiness, Texas, Oklahoma, some of New Mexico, the meat industry. Meat really takes off as an industry in this time period, connected to the railroad, developing mostly in the West. Metals, steel, railroads big, and eventually oil. Oil will be big, obviously, in Texas. Oil will be big in Pennsylvania also. So some of the other pieces then, as we see industry transforming the country, is that, as I already said, you begin to see people shifting away from, at least with young people, the idea that they should be civically involved into the idea that they should be personally growing economically. Like, how can I take care of myself? We'll see, and we'll talk more about this next time, that the work and the location of population shifts to the city, to urban, away from agrarian. And so then this begins kind of a change for what is the expectation of the country. I don't know if you had a chance in the past year or two to drive across the country, but I'm still kind of transfixed that even with over 340 million people living here, right? When you drive from Orlando, pretty much anywhere, you go through vast swaths of land in, say, lower Alabama, in kind of northwestern Georgia, in parts of South Carolina, basically every state. And it's just empty land, tons and tons of empty land. So we have a lot more people all packed into very tiny spaces. So that's transformed the country. One of the major transformations that will occur that I think is most interesting to pay attention to is the shift of the American dream. Now, we've talked about this a couple of times before in our sessions together. But if you ask somebody today about the American dream, what they typically talk about, and you've heard this through both political parties, is an idea of wealth, right? So the American dream is to come here and be wealthy. The American dream maybe is to gain wealth, to become excessively rich. They might use words like independent, but they don't mean it in like the political way that it originally meant. They meant it in financial independence, which is a type of independence, but it's not the same thing. Historically, People came to America for what we could call the American dream because they were coming for the opportunity to become self-sustaining, almost always by owning land. The whole point was not to come to America and get a job and then somehow make money, nor for most was it to come to America and create a new idea and then become rich through your new idea. It was to come to this place where there was just miles and miles and miles of empty land and be able to gain your own land in a way that you could not if you were from South America or from Mexico, certainly not from Europe, not from Africa, not from Asia. All these other places had established societies in which most of the land was controlled by the elite of that place. And so there wasn't as much opportunity. So the industrial movement, I think, has this deep societal change to the country in a way I would say that's devastating. I think we have lost a tremendous amount of understanding about the journey of the American experiment because we've lost this idea of what is the American dream. You also see the emergence of marketing, consumerism, which I already mentioned. And then perhaps most damning, but not unsurprising to the transformation that occurs to the industrial movement is the emergence of the super rich. Now, we want to be careful here. We've always had wealthy people. So from the very beginning, when Jamestown is established, one of the stories you may remember is John Smith, Pocahontas fame. He actually had come, but then he left. He went and did other things. He was an explorer. And then he comes back to Jamestown. And Jamestown is failing. It's not doing very well. And one of the reasons it's not doing very well is because there were some lower nobility who were there in Jamestown. And they weren't working. They weren't doing anything because they were the super rich of the time. I don't work. Somebody else works for me. And John Smith came and took over in something of a dictatorial takeover and established rules right out of the Bible. Paul says this: if you won't work, you don't eat. And he put people to work, threw some people in jail, and because he was a tough fighter, warrior guy, he pulled it off. I always like that story because, again, you can see from the very beginning, America was, yes, you're going to have some rich people, but you don't get to act like the super wealthy in Europe. Well, that's all going to change now. And when you see the transformation, and I'll show you this slide again, you can see in 1870, over 53% working in agriculture. If you look just at living, it would be closer to 70% living in agrarian societies. By 1920, that shrunk, and the same shrinkage has happened within where people live. These industrial titans become the super rich. Now, you may know the term robber barons. So I have my students kind of work through that. You know, of course, that the word baron is a term from the feudal age. It's one of the many different titles that would, be out there for the nobility or for people at the upper echelon of the old European system. And so to be a robber baron suggests you cheated and robbed to get there. That probably is first connected to Gould, who I'll show you a picture of him in a second. And because many people watched men like James Gould make money within the railroad, and it felt very clearly like they had to have cheated, and in his case he did, other people to get there. And the success of these individuals will climb to such heights that had never been seen before. And again, I really need to stress this. I mean, we just got finished talking about the Civil War. We talked about the planter elite. We talked about how wealthy they were and how they were most guilty for kind of pushing the Civil War forward, and how, you kind of missed a moment in Reconstruction when the poor whites and all the freed slaves should have banded together into a new group to oppose the rich planter elite. But never, again, Gone with the Wind, yes, it's a big house, and they do own a lot of land, but never did anybody in pre-industrial America have the kind of wealth that these men will have. When you look at these men, and these are just like 5 of the most famous men, these men become wealthy at an amount that was unfathomable And quite honestly, it remains unfathomable. And when you talk about, I could replace these pictures, obviously, with some of the names of people you know today who have, more money individually than some entire countries have. It really raises those questions of morality, of fairness, of what's best for the overall system, right? That's the point, is what's the overall system, in our case here in America, what's going to be good for that system? Now, before we cast too many stones, we have to remind ourselves, what did they do? So Vanderbilt and Gould helped propel the railroad. J.P. Morgan becomes the dominant financier, the dominant banker, and he will throw money around. At one point, we'll see later, there's a major economic depression that happens in the country, and the government turns to Morgan to fix things. He's still going when the Great Depression happens, and they look for him to, for his company to help try to stem the tide in 1929. And they can't at that time. But it tells you a lot when the government's turning to an individual saying, hey, can you give us a loan? Needs a little money. Rockefeller, obviously with oil, Carnegie with steel. These people become the dominant players in developing the society that this picture gives you a picture of Rockefeller looking at one of his plants. And so these big industries begin to develop under the leadership of these men. And it really sets in motion this idea of the corporation. It introduces us to the concept of monopoly. We know monopolies. They're not supposed to be any these days. I don't suppose I'm smart enough to address that question. It sure feels like in some cases there are monopolies. The two types of monopoly that was established at this time, vertical monopoly is the idea of someone controlling the complete good. So when I tell the students this, I always kind of talk about, the cell phone. So you can imagine Apple or Samsung from the very beginning of what it takes to build a phone, including the glass, including the technology, the chips inside, all the different metals, whatever it takes to build the phone from raw material to sold good, including an Apple store to go buy it or a Samsung store to go buy it, an Android store, right? One company would own all of that. That'd be a vertical monopoly. Well, horizontal monopoly is controlling like one piece of the development of a good. So for instance, the glass screens that are on our phones, right? That glass screen, imagine one company alone controlled the making of those glass screens, right? That all the people who made phones couldn't go to somebody else. Well, clearly what a monopoly does is it allows more wealth and more power into the hands of one company within the industry. And ultimately, by the time we get to 1900, it's like, this is not good. And later in our series, we're going to look at what the country does, particularly Theodore Roosevelt, to try to fight back against these. But initially, for 30, 40 years, it's just kind of a run. And when there's a big battle with, for instance, Rockefeller, he's like, why are you attacking me? I don't understand. I'm doing Standard Oil. It's good for everybody. What do you care to the U.S. government? Why do you care if I'm the only one? And so you get into those questions of like, there are pluses or bonuses or benefits to having the power of monopoly. Largely as a country, we've decided they don't outweigh the cons. But that you see this kind of growth. And the challenge that then comes is, how much power do these companies have? Now, the men I showed you before are joined at this time by this amazing amount of technology change and innovation that occurs in this time period. So some of these names, particularly Ford and Westinghouse, Bell, you and I all grew up with Ma Bell being the only phone around. You guys remember that. And again, it struck down monopolies in my teen years. So these guys are not immune from being, kind of cast into the robber baron, group. But of course, they provided goods for us in a way that for some people, they're heroes, right? Edison with electricity. And of course, Edison, Westinghouse, Tesla, they're all kind of the electricity story. Ford's not the only person making cars. I mean, Chrysler's around at the time. But these guys are part of what that transformative power. When you have enough money, you have the innovation, you can not only make cool things, but you can make them for a lot of people. So here's Henry and his son Edsel in some of the cars. Again, there was the Chrysler car also that was made. Actually, that was the first one that had a practical gas. You can see why it's called a horseless buggy, because it basically was a small combustion engine put on what had been a buggy drawn by a horse. That's what that basically is. There's Bell using the phone. Electricity lighting up. Electricity is going to transform everything. It's going to transform industry, how industry works, the speed of industry. You're going to go from workers working daylight hours to working 24/7, which is going to lead to more speed and more production, but also more speed equaling more danger for the worker. Of course, the Wright brothers, first flight, once man gets the flight, now a lot of other changes are going to occur in the 20th century. So now what does this do for labor? Because the worker then becomes the other piece of the puzzle. And one of the changes that occurs when you go national with the industry, and again, we know this, right? I tell the students, a lot of them will be working part-time work or hourly work. And I'm like, does the owner of your company know you? And of course they're like, well, no. I'm like, of course he doesn't. He probably doesn't even know your manager, because your manager probably answers to a regional manager who answers to somebody else, or probably 3 or 4 levels before you get to the C-suite. So you begin to break down. Previously, the owner had been somebody you would know. Your father would have gone to school with the owner, so you got to work there, or your family had worked there and had been close friends in church. Everybody knew each other. There's this kind of relationship. And now that all kind of goes away. You really have the elimination or the end of the craftsperson, the person who makes those dresses, who makes those bonnets, makes those wagons, and has an expertise to themselves. And work kind of moves away into a 24/7 kind of race, go, 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 kind of fast, fast, fast. There was never really as much of a gap in the pay scale. But now, all of a sudden, there's going to be a massive gap between what somebody was paid, even in a factory like Ford. So Ford famously was able to speed up production, make more money, and he raised significantly the hourly wage of his employees. So, yay, way to go, Mr. Ford. When he did that, the gap between his workers and him and his leaders and their pay was vast. It had never been like that before. And when you tie that in, as we'll see next week, to the challenges in the city for how to have enough money to live and make your way, it was very damaging to culture and society. You begin having this distance between the worker, and you can think of how that would play in with something like injuries and danger in the workplace. Previously, if you were sick or your wife was having a baby, you knew the owner. You would just, you'd work that out in a relationship. Now you are no longer in a place where you could have that kind of a conversation, and work becomes more dangerous. So then this leads to the challenges of what do you do for the worker? And what happens to the worker in these conditions? And they're not all horrible conditions. One of the things with this picture of the young man with the broom, I always have to remind my students, up to this point in human history, all children worked all the time, right? So it's not like children had never been working and then the evil factories came along and forced kids to work. And I'll tell them stories about my family and my father and his brothers and sisters, and him at age 4, and maybe some of you having similar experiences, working with the chickens. You had jobs to do. You didn't just sit around and play. There was no sitting around and playing on a PlayStation. You played, you had fun, but you worked. So the idea of the family moving to the city and the children still working is not an unusual thing. But clearly it's an indoor setting. It's not outdoors. It's not connected to the family farm. And with the speed and the 24/7 nature, it can be more and more dangerous for children. So this begins to raise questions. The answer will come in with the idea of the union. In other words, individually, if I'm just a cog in the machine and the owner does not know me, the solution is for us collectively to work together. Now, the first unions were almost always specifically within a field, a trade union. But they realized early, if they can all collectively stop working and strike, then this can harm the financial bottom line of the company. And not surprisingly, the first major strike, national strike, was at the railroad. It involved the B&O line. The B&O line had cut wages 10%, which was not an unusual thing. We talked today about companies, if they're going to be forced to pay a higher wage. And I guess there are companies who maybe in times of economic downturn will ask their employees to take a pay cut. And there's been some of those in this time of the pandemic. But have you read those like I've read those? You're thinking, when was the last time you read an article about a company cutting pay? They might have 3 or 4 years with no raises, no cost of living expenses increases, which is tough. But you don't. But back then, if they just felt like they weren't making enough money, they'd cut wages. They didn't care. And what's significant is to see, and this will be the case for the next 25 to 35 years, is when this happened, the owners will complain to government, and government, in this case it was President Hayes, will allow the federal troops to be brought in. And between the state militias and federal troops, they will openly attack the workers. So there's a real sense at this early stage of people not appreciating the workers' plight, nor their attempt to unionize, to defend themselves. There's the story of the Molly Maguires, which was a code name for an early union that was involved in both railroad and coal. And in 1877, they were basically trapped in bad, unfair criminal investigation, to which you can see 10 of their leaders were executed. Later, 100 years later, they were extolled. They were found not guilty, but obviously far, far too late. So even early on, when you read the papers and you listen to certainly the leaders, like the editors and the writers, but even amongst some of the average people who weren't in labor, you see a real kind of battleground over this issue, again, of the changing societal scenario. You didn't have unions before because there was no need to have unions. You kind of worked on your own farm, or you worked in a local place with somebody you knew from the community. Now this has all gone away and changed. The Knights of Labor become the first really national industry. They're the first industry that went beyond trade unions and just set up a major union of all workers. They opened their door to women, which made them very controversial for some. More controversial in the South was they opened their doors to African Americans. This will both help them be on the kind of cutting edge of modern America, but also will hurt them amongst some, groups who had either their sexist or racist views in ways, that would kind of cast aspersions. The Knights of Labor wanted to do more transformative work. So this will set them apart from some other labor unions we'll see in a second. Now, one of the challenges, and we don't really have time to get into it, one of the challenges for this time period in world history, and was true in the United States, was the current political structures were all being challenged. And one of the dominant views, particularly in Europe at this point, was the anarchist view. Now, you know the word anarchy, and typically when people hear anarchy, they have a bad view connected to it, because the idea of anarchy is mass chaos, right? And I know how we got there, and so it's a good fair use of the word. But when you talk about from a political system, an anarchist view is very closely aligned with Jean-Jacques Rousseau, in which the whole point is the human does not need any government at all. Now, Rousseau ultimately gives way and is kind of, okay, I'll take democracy if I can't have the anarchist view, that we don't need any rules. We're so good that it will leave everybody alone. Now, Rousseau noted that the problem with this is that property, personal property, and here's where he diverts from Locke. Personal property is what causes the problems, right? So there's a movement in Europe and to some degree in the United States that we have to eliminate the idea of property, and we have to eliminate the idea of the overarching government, and so an anarchist view. Unfortunately for the anarchist, and this is why you get the word anarchy meaning chaos, when they do the things that they do, typically what you see happening is they use violence to get there. So when they use violence to get there, it obviously comes across wrong. And this was most famously seen at the Haymarket bombing. So in Chicago in 1886, the Knights of Labor had decided to kind of organize a meeting. We're going to have a march on May Day. May 1st was seen as a very important day in Europe and in America for labor and for the workers. And so they're going to have this big important march. And at the same time in Chicago, the McCormick Reaper Works was having a strike. There was a strike going on there. So these two things were happening at the same time. And so the company would bring in, and you may know this from labor unions, one way to break a strike is to bring other workers in to work the machinery so that the company continues to make money. These strike breakers are often known as scabs. Obviously, there's an opposition to that. So there can be a fight and a clash, and there was on May the 3rd. So on May the 4th, there was another gathering in the Haymarket Square in Chicago. Speeches were made. It was a pretty small gathering compared to what had been on May the 1st, but it was enough people. After the speeches are given, so when more of the famous leaders of the Knights of Labor had left, there ended up being a clash between the Chicago police and those left around, right? So several hundred people, and somebody threw a bomb. It's sort of like a hand grenade. This is before hand grenades existed, but it's sort of like a Molotov cocktail, an explosive that someone could throw. And unfortunately, it killed several police officers. They, not surprisingly, pulled out their hand revolvers and shot and fired back. So many more people were wounded and may have died. We just don't know that number because they all fled to avoid being arrested. So the city of Chicago arrests 8 leaders, including some of the people who weren't even there at the time. Again, the idea of trying to break the Knights of Labor. The relationship between the violence, the anarchists, and the Knights of Labor will ultimately kind of ruin that labor union and was a step backwards for the work of labor, trying to get equality for the workers. You can see the Illinois state attorney, of course, Grinnell, that gentleman, you can see the quote there, convict these men, make examples of them, hang them. He had been a lawyer for the railroad. So he was a stockholder for the railroad. So he was not neutral, right? But out of that came the American Federation of Labor, led by Samuel Gompers. You may think, well, I've never heard of the Knights of Labor. Well, you've heard of the AFL. So the AFL is still around today. I know now it's connected to the CIO. They're kind of a partnership. Because of what happened with the Knights of Labor, the AFL will focus just on things like wages and safer workplace conditions. But they will still be an active national industry or labor or union to try to protect the workers. There's going to be a long time to go until there's any national laws made in the 1930s, basically, for the worker. And that's why even after the Haymarket bombing, there's going to continue to be efforts by many people within labor to fight back. And the last thing I want to show you here is what happened with the Pullman Company. So, almost a decade later, during the Depression of 1893, the Pullman Company, George Pullman, he of course created the luxury railroad cars. Again, if we were together, I'd ask one of you if you'd ever ridden on one. I have not. I don't think that the Amtrak has any nice cars similar to the Pullman cars. But he cut his wages. Now, Pullman was doing something that in Europe was an early form of socialism. He built a company town, basically. And so he had a town for all of his workers, healthcare, food, groceries, but he controlled all the prices, right? So it sounds good, but at the same time, there wasn't a lot of freedom. When he cut wages, he did not cut prices, didn't cut the rents. So ultimately in 93, the railroad union struck. And they, again, like in 77, were able to extend it across the entire nation. This introduces us to a man named Eugene Debs. And I know we got to go, so I'm just going to close it with this and saying, Debs becomes the real leader over the next 30 years of a voice for equity amongst the common person. Now, you may know that ultimately he'll become the leader of the Socialist Party of America. Try to, for now, withhold any judgment about that word socialism. Just kind of leave it over there. Just understand that once again, the US government brings in military forces. You see 8,000 troops were sent to Chicago. Many workers were killed in clashes with the government soldiers. And so here again, you have the federal government, using its force. And remember, Grover Cleveland was a reform president. So you'd think he'd be on the side of the workers. He's not. And so you can see this kind of setting where Eugene Debs begins to really think the only way to get change, remember back to where we started, that this whole season after the Civil War is one that's demanding some kind of change needs to happen to bring more equity, to bring more civil rights for all people, right? We want to broaden that, not just this rich elite. How do we do that? And Debs begins thinking the only way to do this is through a political takeover. Now, he will not be successful, as you know. We've never had a socialist president, or at least not open socialist president. But he represents what's going to be coming, and we will talk about in probably 3 or 4 weeks, the political response against this feeling of something's not working right in the country. So what we can end with is understanding that industry at this point not going away. And we begin to have concerns that the powerful few like Morgan and Rockefeller are going to be somehow able to control even the national elections. When McKinley is elected in 92, in 96, there's some who believe that that election was bought by Morgan and his industrial titans. We won't talk about this in our sessions, but if you study imperialism, particularly from a European point of view, imperialism and industrialism are wrapped together. So that's kind of typically imperialism has got a negative tone. That's something we don't like. Well, that's kind of fed by industrialism. And then we talked again about this kind of warping of the American dream. And what we'll look at next time is what does this do to the urban cities and the life of the person who lives in the city as we kind of keep looking at the society and cultural changes that are occurring in this time period. All right, that's going to be a good place for us to stop. Again, boy, I wish we were together so I could ask if you had any questions. Again, I want to urge you, if you have questions, if you're in your own home, you can type them to me in the chat and I'll answer them. Or if you're there in Stover, you can always feel free to let Becca know, or you can email me. Thank you so much. I hope you guys have a wonderful, wonderful week.